This video contains graphic descriptions of real-life child abuse, torture, and murder. It is not suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. This content is presented for educational and awareness purposes only. All images are symbolic. The events described are factual and part of public record. Sylvia Marie Likens entered the world on January 3, 1949, into a family that, while loving in their own way, was fractured by instability and financial hardship. She was the third of 5 children, born to Lester and Elizabeth Betty Likens, both of whom worked odd jobs and traveled with the carnival circuit. Sylvia had a twin sister named Jenny, who suffered from polio and wore a leg brace, something that made her especially vulnerable, yet dependent on Sylvia for comfort and protection. Sylvia was known to be a polite, quiet teenager. She loved music, had a gentle voice, and often helped care for her younger siblings. Although her home life was financially strained, she did what she could to maintain a sense of normalcy. Her older and younger brothers, Danny and Benny, often took up odd jobs to help the family, and the twins, Sylvia and Jenny, were particularly close. The bond between them was deepened by the instability that surrounded them. Their parents, Lester and Betty, were not abusive, but they were overwhelmed. Constant travel for work meant that the children were often separated, staying with relatives or acquaintances for long periods. The family's economic situation was precarious, and the children were accustomed to going without, sometimes food, sometimes clothes, but always consistency. Education was sporadic, friendships were temporary, and addresses changed frequently. In the summer of 1965, when Sylvia was just 16, Lester and Betty were once again traveling for work with the carnival. In an effort to ensure some stability for the girls, they arranged for Sylvia and Jenny to stay with a local woman in Indianapolis, Indiana. The woman had 7 children of her own and appeared responsible. She was a churchgoer and had previously taken in boarders. Her name was Gertrude Baniszewski. For $20 a week, Gertrude would feed, house, and care for Sylvia and Jenny until Lester and Betty returned. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement. What Sylvia and Jenny couldn't have known, and what their parents couldn't have imagined, was that this decision would seal Sylvia's fate. The home at 3850 East New York Street was not what it seemed from the outside. The structure was worn and hollow, much like the woman who lived inside it. Gertrude Baniszewski was 37 years old, frail, underweight, and addicted to barbiturates. She had already endured 2 failed marriages and lived with a rotating cast of children, ex-lovers, and boarders. Her mental and physical health were in rapid decline. Despite this, she managed to maintain an outward appearance of piety and control, at least enough to convince Lester Likens that his daughters would be safe. But within days of Sylvia and Jenny's arrival, it became clear that this household was anything but safe. Gertrude Baniszewski's descent into cruelty didn't happen overnight, but it didn't take long for Sylvia and Jenny to notice something was wrong. At first, Gertrude seemed indifferent, distant perhaps due to her ongoing health issues or the stress of caring for 9 children in total. She smoked constantly, coughed with a rattling breath, and rarely seemed to eat herself. Her house was a disaster. The children, hers and now Sylvia and Jenny, slept on mattresses on the floor. The home lacked heating, proper plumbing, and sanitation. Gertrude's 7 children ranged in age from toddlers to late teens. Her oldest daughter, Paula Baniszewski, was 17 and already pregnant. Paula had a simmering temper and a sharp tongue. Then there were Stephanie and John, both of whom would later play disturbing roles in what was to come. Gertrude's youngest children, too young to understand much of what unfolded, would absorb the chaos as part of their normal world. In the early days, the punishments Sylvia received were minor. If she left dishes in the sink, she'd be scolded. If she ate too much food, she'd be accused of stealing. But the turning point came when the $20 payments from Lester Likens began arriving late. To Gertrude, this was a personal betrayal, one that festered with every passing day. Whether it was the absence of money or her own resentment at having to care for 2 additional girls, her behavior began to shift from strict to sadistic. She began singling out Sylvia as a source of blame. Ginny, being disabled and less mobile, was spared much of the abuse, but was forced to witness almost all of it. Gertrude's verbal assaults became relentless. Sylvia was called filthy, a prostitute, a liar. She was accused of being pregnant, despite no evidence. She was forbidden to eat, sometimes for days. And then the physical beatings began. What's more horrifying is that Gertrude wasn't always the one delivering the blows. She began to encourage her own children to discipline Sylvia. Sometimes they'd slap her. Other times they used belts, sticks, and fists. The line between punishment and entertainment began to blur. But it didn't stop there. What made the case of Sylvia Likens so uniquely horrifying was not only the abuse itself, but the number of people who participated in it. As the weeks went by, Gertrude became more creative and deliberate in her torment. She turned her hatred into a ritual and her household into a theater of pain. She invited neighborhood children into the home, kids who should have been playing in parks or attending school. Instead, they gathered in her living room and basement to take part in what became routine torture. Gertrude would instruct the other children to punish Sylvia for imagined crimes. Sometimes she claimed Sylvia had insulted the family. Other times she said Sylvia spread lies at school or had become sexually promiscuous. These were lies, every single one of them. But to the kids, it didn't matter. The authority of an adult, especially one that permitted and encouraged violence, was all they needed. Sylvia was forced to strip in front of others. She was beaten, ridiculed, spit on, burned with cigarettes. Objects were thrown at her head. She was denied use of the bathroom and eventually forced to defecate on herself. The kids in the neighborhood, some as young as 10, were given permission to abuse her as they pleased. One boy, Richard Hobbs, carved obscene phrases into her stomach with a hot needle. Another, Coy Hubbard, Stephanie Baniszewski's boyfriend, repeatedly slammed Sylvia's head into the wall, laughing while doing it. These weren't isolated moments of madness. This was daily life in that home. And no one said a word. Neighbors heard sounds. A local minister visited the house once. Sylvia herself whispered for help to a classmate at school, but no one acted. Fear, apathy, trust in appearances. Whatever the reason, it kept the truth buried until it was far too late. As the summer of 1965 gave way to early autumn, Sylvia's world shrank. What had once been limited to the cracked walls of the Baniszewski house was now confined to a windowless, damp, and insect-infested basement. It became her final prison. After weeks of escalating abuse, Gertrude made a new decision. Sylvia was no longer allowed to live upstairs. Her crimes, according to Gertrude, had reached a new low. Accusations of theft, uncleanliness, and being too dirty to live among the children. In truth, Sylvia had done nothing to deserve any of it. Gertrude instructed her sons and neighborhood boys to carry Sylvia's body down the narrow wooden stairs. She was weak, barely conscious. Her limbs trembled as she tried to stand, her knees buckling with each movement. Her skin had become pale and mottled, bruises in various stages of healing covering her from head to toe. Her eyes were sunken, and her lips cracked with dehydration. There was no bed in the basement, no chair, no blankets, no bathroom. Sylvia was made to sleep naked on the concrete floor. When she needed to urinate, she was forced to do so in a corner. Her only companions were the rats and cockroaches.
One of the most horrifying acts committed against Sylvia Likens would become central to the trial and to history. It was an act so depraved, so ritualistically sadistic, that even the most seasoned investigators would struggle to understand how children could participate in it. It began with Gertrude announcing that Sylvia had been asking for it. She claimed Sylvia was proud of being promiscuous, an accusation entirely invented. To punish her, she said, the world needed to know what Sylvia truly was. And so she called for Richard Hobbs. Richard was a local boy, only 14 years old, who frequently visited the Baniszewski home. He had become one of the more active participants in Sylvia's abuse. He was not coerced, he volunteered. That day, Gertrude handed him a sewing needle, heated it with a match, and instructed him to engrave a message into Sylvia's stomach. What followed was one of the most inhumane moments of the entire ordeal. Richard kneeled beside Sylvia, barely conscious, her ribs protruding, her lips whispering faint pleas for help, and began pressing the needle into her flesh. With each puncture, the smell of burning skin filled the air. Blood oozed down her sides. The letters took shape slowly, painfully. And the message? I'm a prostitute and proud of it. Those were the words Richard Hobbs etched into her torso, letter by letter, under Gertrude's orders and in front of several witnesses. This wasn't hidden, this wasn't a secret, it was a show. Another child, Shirley Baniszewski, Gertrude's daughter, was instructed to dot the I with a hot iron. She complied without protest. Sylvia didn't fight back. She couldn't. Her body was too far gone. When the mutilation was done, Sylvia curled into herself, shaking. Her skin on the stomach was raw and inflamed. She would develop an infection shortly after. Her breathing became ragged, her eyes didn't always stay open, her mind was slipping. But Gertrude wasn't done. She forced Sylvia to write a letter, dictated word for word, that would later serve as a suicide note. In it, Sylvia was made to claim she had run away and been attacked by a gang of boys. It was a final act of manipulation, meant to absolve Gertrude and her household of guilt. It was written in shaky handwriting, soaked in blood and sweat. Sylvia obeyed, because by then she knew no one was coming to help. By late October, Sylvia's body was beginning to shut down. Her once rosy cheeks were sunken. Her hair was falling out in patches. Her feet were so swollen she couldn't walk. Her teeth were loose. Her internal organs had begun to fail. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was barely audible. "What are you going to do to me now?" "I want to die. Just let me go to sleep." These were the kinds of things Sylvia whispered during her final days. It was no longer about escape. It was no longer about rescue. It was simply about ending the pain. On October 25, 1965, Gertrude decided Sylvia was faking her condition. She dragged her upstairs, yes, dragged, and dropped her into a bathtub filled with scalding water. Her head slammed against the side, she slipped in and out of consciousness. Later that night, she was dragged back down to the basement. She asked for food. She asked to see Jenny. Her words were slurred. She couldn't sit up straight. One witness said she kept repeating, "Daddy, are you here? Can I go home now?" She defecated on herself again. Gertrude hit her for it. On the morning of October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens died. She was lying on a moldy mattress in the basement. Her body was bruised, burned, and emaciated. Her heart gave out. She was just 16. On the afternoon of October 26, 1965, Gertrude Baniszewski finally picked up the phone and dialed the police. She was calm, rehearsed, and played the role of concerned guardian with practiced ease. She told the operator that a young girl had died in her home. She claimed the girl, Sylvia Likens, had run away from home, returned beaten and abused by a gang of boys, and then collapsed from her injuries. It was the story she had carefully crafted. The same story she forced Sylvia to write in that final desperate letter. Gertrude hoped that by getting ahead of the situation, she could mask 3 months of torture with one tidy lie. But her story unraveled the moment police stepped into the house. The first officers on the scene were stunned. Sylvia's body lay on a filthy, blood-stained mattress in the basement. Her eyes were open, but lifeless. She had died with no one beside her. Her body told a story that contradicted everything Gertrude had claimed. There were over 150 wounds on her body. Her skin was covered in burns, scars, and bruises. Her lips were split. Her fingernails were broken. Her hands were swollen. Her bones protruded through her skin. Her stomach bore the now infamous branding, "I'm a prostitute, and proud of it." The smell of infection and decay filled the air. It was not the scent of a sudden death. It was the stench of long, slow, and systematic suffering. The responding officers immediately knew they were not looking at an isolated incident. They were looking at a crime scene, a prolonged, calculated act of human cruelty. Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, stood quietly in the corner. She was frightened, frail, and trembling. One of the officers gently pulled her aside to speak privately. And what Jenny said changed everything. "You get me out of here, and I'll tell you everything." Jenny's statement to police was not only heartbreaking, it was overwhelming. In measured words, she began to describe what had really happened inside the house on East New York Street. She spoke of the beatings, the starvation, the cigarette burns, the forced nudity. She told them about the branding, the denial of water, and the long days Sylvia spent locked in the basement. Most shockingly, Jenny named names. She listed not just Gertrude Baniszewski and her daughter Paula, but also Gertrude's sons John and James, her daughter Stephanie, and even several neighborhood children, Coy Hubbard, Richard Hobbs, and others. Officers returned to the Baniszewski home and began questioning every child present. Some tried to deny involvement, others quickly gave up details. The truth was too gruesome to hide, and the sheer number of participants made any coordinated cover-up impossible. By nightfall, Gertrude Baniszewski was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Paula Baniszewski was arrested for second-degree murder. Stephanie, John, Coy, and Richard were all taken into custody. The neighborhood was in shock. The media caught wind quickly. Rumors swirled. Reporters flooded the area. Cameras clicked. Headlines ran in bold type. Torture house discovered in Indianapolis. Teen girl murdered by guardian and children. Mother, kids, neighbors accused in horror killing. The community demanded answers. How could something like this happen? How could so many people be involved? And most of all, how could so many others ignore it? Meanwhile, Sylvia's body was transferred to the county coroner for an autopsy. The results would only confirm what police already suspected. The official report described extreme malnutrition, massive internal bleeding, and shock due to prolonged physical trauma. Her nails were nearly ripped from her hands. Her vaginal region was swollen from repeated kicks. She had dozens of burns, open sores, and infected wounds. Her branding on her stomach was still fresh. This wasn't just abuse. This wasn't even manslaughter. It was torture.
Paula Baniszewski's defense team argued she had only hit Sylvia once or twice out of anger, but had no intent to kill. Paula had given birth to a child during the trial, further complicating public sympathy. Stephanie Baniszewski turned state's witness and testified against her own mother in exchange for immunity. The courtroom heard testimony from multiple neighborhood kids, including Richard Hobbs, who described branding Sylvia under Gertrude's instruction. Coy Hubbard confessed to body-slamming Sylvia and laughing while doing it. One boy told the court that hurting Sylvia was something to do after school. The jury listened in disbelief as story after story revealed the depravity behind Gertrude's walls. The prosecution argued that even though others joined in, Gertrude held absolute control, not only over her children, but over the neighborhood kids as well. When the trial concluded, the verdict was announced. Gertrude Baniszewski was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Paula Baniszewski was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life, though it was later reduced on appeal. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Baniszewski were all convicted of manslaughter and received sentences of 2 to 21 years each. They all served fewer than 8 years. Gertrude would go on to serve just 20 years in prison before being released on parole in 1985. She changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen and moved to Iowa, where she lived quietly until her death from cancer in 1990. She never took responsibility for Sylvia's death. She never apologized, and she never admitted guilt. As the guilty verdicts were read and the sentences handed down, the city of Indianapolis tried to process what had happened, but the community wasn't just in shock, they were ashamed. Sylvia Likens hadn't died in secret. Her cries had echoed through the thin walls of a crowded house. Neighbors had seen bruises. Children had spoken about what they witnessed. Teachers noticed she had stopped coming to school. Everyone had seen something, but no one had done anything. Local news ran exposés. Journalists described the house at 3850 East New York Street as a place of ritual abuse. Community leaders called for stronger child welfare laws, and behind all the public statements was a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. Sylvia could have been saved. She could have been saved if a teacher had insisted on an investigation. She could have been saved if the neighbor who heard the screams had called police. She could have been saved if a single adult had stepped forward and said, "Enough." Instead, she was buried in a white casket with a small inscription, "Our darling daughter." Her funeral was attended by family, police, members of the public, and several reporters. Her parents, Lester and Betty Likens, were devastated. They never forgave themselves for leaving her in Gertrude's care, even though they had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. The Likens family filed a civil lawsuit against the city and local authorities, claiming negligence. It never gained traction. No one from CPS was fired, no new laws were immediately passed. The trial had made headlines, but policy change came slowly, if at all. The public moved on, but Sylvia's family never could. Many people involved in the case went on to live relatively normal lives, despite their actions. Gertrude Baniszewski, the mastermind behind Sylvia's torture and murder, was released in 1985 after serving just 20 years in prison. She moved to Iowa, changed her name, and lived quietly until her death from cancer in 1990. She never spoke publicly about the case. She never issued a statement of remorse. And she never admitted guilt. Paula Baniszewski was released early as well. She also changed her name to Paula Pace and worked for years as a teacher's aide in a public school system until her true identity was revealed in 2012. She was fired, but no criminal charges were filed. She reportedly still lives under a new identity. Richard Hobbs, who branded Sylvia's stomach, served less than 3 years. He died of cancer in 1972 at age 21. Coy Hubbard, who had repeatedly body-slammed Sylvia and bragged about it in court, also served a short sentence. He went on to have multiple arrests for domestic violence and died in 2007. Stephanie Baniszewski, who had testified against her mother, was never charged. She changed her name, reportedly married, and disappeared from public records. John Baniszewski, the youngest of Gertrude's sons, served just a few years. In later interviews, he claimed he had become a born-again Christian and deeply regretted his involvement. He changed his name to John Blake and died in 2005. And then there was Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister. She lived a quiet life after the trial, marrying and raising a family. She spoke only rarely about the trauma, but when she did, she emphasized how much she loved and missed Sylvia. Jenny passed away in 2004 from a heart attack. She was 54 years old. Her gravestone is next to Sylvia's. In the decades since her death, Sylvia Likens has become a tragic symbol of how a community and a system can fail the most vulnerable. Her case has been taught in classrooms, studied in psychology and law courses, and featured in books, documentaries, and films. Most notably, The Girl Next Door was inspired by her ordeal, though fictionalized, and An American Crime, 2007, portrayed the events more directly. But beyond the headlines, the films, and the horror, was a real girl. Sylvia loved music. She smiled easily. She liked roller skating. She cared for her sister Jenny like a second mother. She wasn't a fighter. She didn't know how to scream back. She was quiet and trusting and kind. That kindness, in the hands of a sadistic woman and a complicit community, was weaponized against her. Her final words, according to the coroner and police, may have been, "I'm going to die now." That haunting sentence stayed with every officer who worked the case, every juror who heard the trial, and every reader who's ever learned her story. In 2001, a memorial was finally installed at Willard Park in Indianapolis. A plaque bears Sylvia's name alongside a bench and a tree. It stands not just as a reminder of what happened, but as a promise that it should never happen again. In 2010, Indiana established Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center, an organization dedicated to helping abused children, giving them a safe place to speak, be heard, and begin healing. Sylvia didn't die in vain. Her voice was silenced in life, but in death, she became the voice for thousands of children who suffer in silence. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. Thank you.